Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining day 2 of the NARAL Activist Summit. Before we get started, just a couple of quick announcements. If you're experiencing any type of issue with your video or a blank screen, please try refreshing your browser window. If that doesn't work, or if you need additional tech support, make sure to click on the link in the Expo button and visit the help desk. We have a whole team of support staff who are waiting there to help you. Okay, welcome again. I'm Ellie Langford, Research Director at NARAL Pro-Choice America, and my pronouns are she, her. At NARAL, I run our opposition research program, contribute to our message testing and polling program as an expert on the far right, and lead our anti-disinformation work, which of course is the topic of today's plenary session. Over the past year or so, I've been working with NARAL President Elise Hogue on NARAL's new book and limited podcast series, The Lie That Binds. We'll be sharing a link to The Lie That Binds and website in the chat. So if you're interested in getting more information about that, you can definitely check there. Our goal with that project was to arm NARAL's members and allies with the best information possible about what strategies and tactics the radical right uses against us, so that we can all be more strategic in the work that we do during this critical year. Both the book and the podcast take a deep dive look at the threats we're facing right now, so I really do encourage you to check them out. After all that research, one issue that really stood out to me as a particular threat that we urgently need to address is disinformation, the topic of today's discussion. I'm so glad we're able to drill down on the important issue in today's plenary. And I just want to be clear, I'm going to use the word disinformation throughout this conversation, which we define as false information that is deliberately created to harm or manipulate people. You might also hear some of the panelists talk about misinformation, which is defined as false information, but not necessarily intentional. We will be primarily focused on disinformation today, however. This conversation will happen in two parts. First, Senator Jeff Merkley will join me for a discussion about the threat of disinformation right now, and particularly its impact in this critical election year. Then, in the second half, text expert Ifeoma Ozoma will join me to dig into the details of this issue, how this all works on social media, and what we can do to fight back. At the end, we'll save some time for questions. These should be great conversations, and I'm really excited to dive in with you all. But before we get started, I want to give you all a chance to introduce yourselves. So using the chat box, please tell us what's your name, what are your pronouns, and what city or state are you in right now? After that's done, we'll start to get started. So first, I want to introduce you all to Christelle Allen, the Executive Director of NARAL Pro-Choice Oregon. She has done really incredible work in the state, leading the organization's efforts to successfully re-elect Oregon Governor Kate Brown and decisively defeat Measure 106, a failed attempt by anti-abortion extremists to pass backdoor legislation on abortion in Oregon. In 2019, she also worked with a broad and diverse group of partners to pass HB 2005, the most inclusive paid family and medical leave act in the nation. Prior to her time at NARAL, Christelle also had a record of impressive campaign and policy victories. She's the first woman of color to lead her organization and looks forward to working with partners to dismantle racism within health systems and defend the Reproductive Health Equity Act during this time of serious budget cuts due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Christelle, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much, Ellie. And thank you for the kind introduction. My name is Christelle Allen. I use she and her pronouns, and I am the very new Executive Director of NARAL Pro-Choice Oregon. As a leader of the pro-choice movement in Oregon for the last 43 years, we really work to defend and expand access to abortion, contraceptives, gender-affirming care, and the full spectrum of reproductive services. We also work to expand equity and inclusion and improve outcomes because we believe firmly that abortion is healthcare and a right isn't a right if not everyone can afford it. I've had the pleasure and the privilege to be able to work in Oregon progressive politics for over 10 years now. I grew up in the state capital, Salem, Oregon, and I grew up in a very diverse family. And now I'm able to bring that lived experience in a state that is becoming increasingly diverse, but has a long way to go in centering the people most impacted by systems that were never designed to serve them. They were never designed to serve anyone than mostly the people who designed them. So that is the work, the really deep work that I'm most excited to tackle in my new role. I've seen how leadership can drive this change, and Oregon has a very proud history of pro-choice champions. In Oregon, we are a state in which we work collectively. We listen first, we lead with empathy, and we call truth to power. Sometimes it doesn't, it may not be so apparent given our laid back Northwest style, but we don't necessarily really show that this is a state with true revolutionaries and innovators. The events of last month with Trump's basically illegal occupation of Portland's Black Lives Movement was a perfect example of us coming together in order to fight for what's right. And on the front line of that fight was Senator Jeff Merkley. I'm a very proud former campaign staffer. And as Oregon's U.S. Senator, Senator Merkley has always been someone who has been fighting for working Oregonians since he became our House Speaker in 2007, which is when I came to first know him. And as House Speaker, he led the most productive legislative session in decades. That session, we are still seeing the impact of it today with increased education funding, expanded access to affordable prescription drugs. He's passed landmark environmental and energy legislation, established domestic partnerships in our state, and created Oregon's first rainy day fund. And in the US Senate, he's continued to be someone who's standing up for working families to create living wage jobs and to really do whatever he can to be stabilizing so many families that are facing such serious challenges in the wake of COVID-19. He currently serves on the Senate Committee of Appropriations, Environmental and Public Works, Budget Committee, and Foreign Relations. He also has demonstrated tremendous leadership in the fight against Kavanaugh's appointment. I just want to tell a little story of when I was at NARAL as our political director. And on the day of the Senate vote, Senator Merkley used his time in the early hours of that morning to share the stories of survivors of sexual assault. At our organization, we had reached out and collected those stories and worked with his staff to be basically centering that fight on the people who were really needed to be centered in conversations that weren't happening. He then, on that same day, flew across the country to be the keynote speaker at our 2018 gala and to numerous standing ovations. At the onset of this latest pandemic, he reached out to our organization very early and asked what he could be doing to ensure that access to reproductive care remained available during this pandemic. He listened and he shared our serious concerns about this growing threat of healthcare consolidations, especially with health organizations that have tremendous power and are also religiously affiliated. We were in the few months of the spring facing a potentially huge merger of Oregon's largest Medicaid management organization and with a private healthcare affiliated insurer that had a terrible record of denying care, reproductive care, gender affirming care. And it was his voice and his leadership in which that deal was called off. That's the type of leader Senator Merkley is. We are so proud of his work, calling truth to power in Oregon, and I am tremendously honored to be introducing him today. Thank you, Senator Merkley.
Senator Merkley, thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome. It's great to be with you. Thank you for the invitation.
We really appreciate having your voice on this conversation. And I know that you've been thinking a ton about disinformation lately and its impact on both our health and our democracy in this complicated time that we're all living in right now. So I've been really looking forward to get your take on this issue. So I'm just going to dive right in. How important of an issue is disinformation in 2020? And what kind of threats do we all need to be thinking about?
Well, I think as everyone on this Zoom room gathering knows, it's a really big deal. And it isn't that disinformation is new. I mean, let's think about the fact that the tobacco companies forever had extensive research on the impact of tobacco on people's health on cancer, on heart disease, but just proceeded to testify to the American public and in hearings on Capitol Hill that there was no connection whatsoever. But we have seen that role of disinformation become more and more a major tool for powerful lobbies. I think about climate, for example. It's been known for well over 100 years that if you increase carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you increase the temperature of this planet. Massive types of evidence. But we have a fossil fuel industry that has just continuously manufactured disinformation, saying, one, warming's not happening, and then saying, well, warming may be happening, but it's natural warming. And then saying, well, if people are contributing to it, there's nothing we can do about it. Just one strategy of lie after another. And we see this in the conversation over immigration. It was 2 summers ago that I went down to the border, became the first member of Congress to see the children who had been ripped out of their parents' arms, being held in cages, in detention centers. And what was the president saying? The president was saying immigrants comprise a massive swarm of rapists and murderers coming to assault Americans. The truth is that immigrants commit crimes at a far lower rate than native-born Americans. But this was a big lie designed to provoke hatred and opposition to immigrants. And that list goes on and on and on. In the more recent past, we have the unemployment insurance discussion, where the big story the Republicans are promoting is that the $600 per week extra income is preventing people from taking jobs when the jobs are available. And study after study has shown that that's just not true. That's not happening. People would much rather have the security of going back to work at a job than unemployment insurance, which will eventually run out, but they still promote it in that fashion. And the list goes on. For example, on the Black Lives Matter movement, there's a huge effort to promote the idea that George Floyd didn't actually die, and that the protesters are actually being fueled by George Soros organizing them. Or let's go to gun safety, and the big lie there was that the Parkland students were paid crisis actors. So I think we see this powerful strategy, and what makes it perhaps even more powerful than it was in the past is that you have a president who has basically argued the mainstream media is illegitimate and gives false news. So you have the truth tellers being framed as lie tellers. And then you also have this challenge of the power of social media. There was an expression that I heard often when I was growing up, which was, the lie gets halfway around the world before the truth gets its pants on. Well, with social media, that's amplified tremendously. So people can hear about it on the cable television, on social media, from their neighbors, their peers, and absolutely believe it and find it very hard to eventually hear any other information that might dissuade it. So it's a massive, massive problem. And I haven't even started to talk about the impact on elections.
Well, that is the perfect lead into my next question. And I think it's so important that you're highlighting all of the different ways that disinformation impacts us across different issue areas. I know that on Repro, we see it all the time. We're no stranger to disinformation about abortion and healthcare. And I definitely want to talk with you about that later in this discussion. But I think you're absolutely right that disinformation right now is just such a gigantic issue with the upcoming election. And I want to show a quick slide for all of the members who are here today with just a couple of examples. We've had so much evidence that bad actors are looking to weaponize social media right now to both suppress the vote and influence the outcome of the election. I threw a couple of examples on this slide, but there are so many others. These are all from recent elections. On the left, we have a photoshopped image that was used in 2016 and encouraged voters to submit their vote for president via text. This was specifically aimed at Hillary voters, which we know texting in your vote is not a legitimate way to vote. On the lower right, we have an attempt to discourage Democratic men from turning out to vote in 2018, saying that by not voting, Democratic men can make the women's vote worth more, which again is just a misleading attempt to try and suppress Democratic votes. And on the top right, we see a baseless attack on absentee voting from the president himself, which again, we know is a critical way that people are going to be able to safely access the vote during this pandemic. Senator, I know you've been thinking a ton about these issues and specifically about anti-democratic disinformation. So can you talk in a little bit more detail about why that matters so much right now and how you're considering that issue?
Sure, you bet. Our nation is in a massive struggle between the theory embedded in our Constitution of government of, by, and for the people, and the reality that we have government that is by and for the powerful. And we have seen in countries all around the world, when the powerful have such disproportionate power in wealth and in income, they can bring that to bear in multitudinous ways to essentially undermine the power of the people and sustain that dynamic. And so that is really a war that we're in on issue after issue after issue. And I'm thinking now about how we turned the clock back 4 years ago, and we had massive Russian involvement in the campaign. They broke into websites, they stole information, they released that information on critical occasions to undermine Hillary Clinton's campaign. They amplified it through a series of strategies that included up to 1,000 individuals in a building retweeting information, and then using botnets, programs that infect other computers and then put out more information, more comments to create things that would be streaming on Facebook to reinforce big lies. And so we saw massive Russian involvement, and we had a president who proceeded to say Russians weren't involved at all. Complete dishonesty with the public. And so that was one of the big election factors. And then we have another in that the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act. And since they've done that, voter manipulation has exploded across the country. And it includes manipulation like shortening or decreasing the number of polling places, decreasing the number of staff at those polling places, perhaps putting bad equipment into the polling places to delay things, proceeding to put intimidating people outside, telling people the wrong addresses for the polling places. You can see the impact. Sitting on registration forms instead of getting people registered, which we saw the Georgia Secretary of State do this when he was running for governor, and it helped him get elected governor. He's now the governor of Georgia. Stacey Abrams lost by just a tiny amount. And they also saw strategies that involved voter ID. And behind that voter ID is the big lie that without voter ID, people who aren't authorized to vote. And yet that's virtually unheard of. The statistics are you'd be more likely to be struck by lightning than to have someone discover that somebody had voted who shouldn't vote. Those rare instances when it happens have been primarily instances where somebody's in one state, they vote in an early primary, they move to another state, they vote in a later primary, now a resident of the new state, not allowed to vote in two primaries. Very, very rare, very minor issues. And people who are not able to vote as citizens are afraid to vote. Often, even when they're legitimate, they're afraid to vote because they don't want to encounter or cause any sort of investigation. So that whole argument about voter fraud is just a complete big lie of false information, disinformation campaign used to attempt to shore up the use of an ID strategy that works primarily against communities of color and poor communities. Or then we have this whole argument that the president is making that vote by mail will lead to a massive scam. And of course, in Oregon, we've been voting by mail since the 2000 elections, so 20 years ago. And we had half of Oregonians voting by mail the previous election in 1998. So we have this long history, and we know from that history that it works really well, that people have to sign the back of the envelope, that the envelope is compared to the signature they have on file, that if it doesn't match their vote is discounted, or they're contacted to make sure that it hasn't just evolved over time. It has been a very, very effective system. If you want to look at the big fraud, it's polling place, polling day manipulation. So vote by mail, which stops all those strategies I was talking about, is an incredibly high integrity system. But the president tweets time and time and time again that it's not a high integrity system. And why does he do that? Because the Republican Party, as the party for the powerful, is afraid of the people and do not want them to participate. And they're looking for every strategy that can decrease participation by communities of color, by the poor, by tribal communities. And they've found to be effective strategies. So we are seeing a lot of concern about this coming election. The intelligence community has been warning us since the last election that the Russians are still manipulating affairs in America. They're still trying to divide divisions between ethnic groups and racial groups in America. They're still trying to put out information that undermines the legitimacy of our democracy, of our democratic republic. And they are still planning and preparing to try to weigh in this coming election in 2020. And what has the executive branch done? They basically, under Trump's leadership, said, it's not true, it's not happening, we don't need to do anything. The whole story about Russia is just not real. And yet they're here, they're doing it. So we have the administration engaged in election manipulation. We have Russia engaged in election misinformation. And these two misinformation or disinformation campaigns are conspiring to create absolute chaos in 2020. We're very, very worried about, because the president's team is gearing up now to attack the legitimacy of the election if he doesn't win. This is what authoritarian dictators do around the world. They rig elections. It's what Trump's involved in, and it's scary as hell for the future of our country.
This is all so important, and I really appreciate you tying all of these issues together, because I think just in the work that I do monitoring the far right, it's so obvious how opportunistic they are, seizing on new changes in the conversation on things like COVID to try and forward these policies. And I think the pivot now that we're seeing towards talking about mail-in voting and absentee voting is just such a good example of that. They are so quick and so easy to pivot. I think one of the other issues about disinformation that we and of course NARAL members are so familiar with is the issue of health disinformation. And I know you know this, Senator. I know all the members on our call know this, but I think we can't emphasize enough that the right to have an abortion, to reproductive freedom, is incredibly popular in this country. I mean, 77% of Americans support the legal right to abortion, and that is a new high. However, that has been true throughout our history. I mean, even in the years before Roe v. Wade, we had a majority of Americans, a strong majority, even a strong majority of Republicans, saying that they support legal access to abortion. I think health disinformation is one of those issues that really cuts across issue areas, but dramatically impacts people's reproductive freedom. We at NARAL define health disinformation as deliberately false information that puts ideology over science and communities at risk. And I know right now we're seeing a gigantic rise in health disinformation during the COVID-19 crisis, but that's something we're very used to seeing in a lot of our work on reproductive freedom. At NARAL, we talk about health disinformation because it's dangerous on a number of different levels. It causes direct harm to people seeking care and has downstream effects like distorting public policy on important issues like reproductive freedom, where it can eventually help the right succeed in blocking access to abortion care. I want to show our members a quick slide with one example that was just so striking to me, but of course, this is one among many. On this slide, we're highlighting health disinformation, and this particular example is anti-choice activist Lila Rose and her organization Live Action, pushing the dangerous health disinformation that abortion is never medically necessary. This is a claim that has been debunked time and time again by medical authorities, and it's an incredibly irresponsible thing to promote at a time when maternal mortality and morbidity rates are already so dangerously high. This particular example was actually fact-checked through Facebook's internal fact-checking process. But after 4 Republican senators pressured Facebook, the company actually censored the doctors who had fact-checked it and let the original content stand without any type of alert or notification that it had been fact-checked and debunked. This actual post is still live today. So, Senator, I would love to hear you talk a little bit about how you're thinking about health disinformation specifically, and right now, especially during this time of the COVID-19 crisis.
It's costing tens of thousands of lives in our country, which is just phenomenal. Let's start with the fact that the experts said we need a national campaign to produce protective equipment, and the president launched no such campaign, saying it wasn't necessary. And then that we needed a national strategy to produce testing because testing is such a critical instrument. And the president failed to put forward a national plan, saying testing actually is more testing is something that makes it look like the disease is going up, and it isn't really going up, which is, of course, completely false. And then that contact tracing would be absolutely essential. And the president's team, or the president, basically said contact tracing just scares people. So it was not taking seriously the advice of the CDC and the medical experts and the scientific experts, and proceeding to strike out on the 3 big tools that nations use to take this on. And so, yes, we would have had a pandemic here, and tens of thousands would have died, but far fewer. Expert after expert has said early action on personal protective equipment, on testing and tracing, would mean a fraction, probably fewer than half, maybe a third of the death rate we've seen now would have occurred. So when has there been such incompetence, but not just incompetence, willful disinformation brought to bear? And then we have things like, for example, really undermining the scientific information that masks make a difference. Well, a mask, if we've understood that this coronavirus moves some by touch, but mostly by aerosol, by breathing, by droplets in the air. So masks both prevent your droplets from getting out there, your aerosol from getting out there, and it prevents you from inhaling other people's droplets. It works 2 ways, really effective. And we have the president deliberately undermining the message that masks are valuable by not wearing one himself, by saying it's an imposition on personal freedom, etc. And then we have his most recent big disinformation on coronavirus, that children are immune. And in this case, Facebook and Twitter did take it down and have left it down. It's such a massive lie. I mean, it is true that children are much more often asymptomatic, that they some do get as sick as adults, but few. But they can easily get the disease and spread the disease as asymptomatic individuals. We know this is a major way the disease spreads. So the president has been blackmailing schools, and I say that in the sense of saying that you will not get funding unless your children go back to school after Labor Day in the classroom. In other words, trying to use money to say, if you want funding for education, you can't use it for the best strategies that you're working out, both for education and health of the children. You have to use it for only a classroom setting, because he felt this will make things look more normal. So it places our entire society at greater risk of spread, because children congregating may often stay healthy, but may often spread the disease. And so we have those. We have other even more. I mean, the president promoted this idea that come warm weather, the virus would just disappear. There'd be no more coronavirus. And we knew in warm countries around the world it was spreading. So there didn't seem any foundation for that. And here we are in August, and we now see that that was another story told to try to make this not appear serious and undermine the effort that the scientists and the healthcare experts were putting forward on protective equipment, on testing, and on tracing. And of course, the reproductive rights world, as you've just pointed out, they seize on disinformation strategy as a major tool that they employ. And you all are experts on that. But we see it in the coronavirus. It has just been so obvious and so lethal. And yet that's where we're at.
Yeah, it is really quite incredible. And we've also been seeing them capitalize on the coronavirus crisis to shut down clinics across the country and do things like block people from getting essential health care, which really is just a whole different level as well.
And you pointed out very, very well the role that Lila Rose has played kind of and others in just one of those mis or disinformation campaigns about reproductive health care and abortion rights.
Yeah, well, it's such a good point. Senator, one other thing I want to ask you. I know that disinformation has become such a gigantic conversation on Capitol Hill over the past several months in particular. I've seen you talk about disinformation in relation to some of the attacks against our democracy that we saw in 2016 and on related issues like we were just talking about with health. I know this is an incredibly difficult problem to solve, and that no one yet has come up with a perfect solution or a way that Congress can really get involved. But I'd love to hear how you and your colleagues are thinking about disinformation right now.
So the challenge we have is the flood. How can I compare this to something else? Think about if you have an effective protective equipment, testing and tracing, you can pretty well use isolation to produce far fewer diseases. And when the disease does pop up, you can bring enormous resources to bear on a rare case. Well, that's very different than if the disease is popping up everywhere all at once and you don't have enough contact tracers, enough testing, enough equipment, and where we are. Let me compare that to the problem with disinformation. If you have an administration that really seeks to maintain credibility and is fact-checking itself before it ever says things publicly, so people have a lot of trust in it. When they do get something wrong, there's a lot of focus on it and a lot of discussion and a lot of correction on that one piece. But if every single day they're putting out 3 or 4 new pieces of disinformation, the public can't keep up, the fact-checkers can't keep up, and as soon as you're discussing the disinformation from the last 3 days, there's a whole new crop that's arisen. So this is a strategy that Stephen Miller promoted for the president during his campaign and during his administration of flood the zone with disinformation. So issue after issue after issue, you just tell whatever story is convenient to your cause and let them all worry about fact checking. You're on to another issue and another disinformation, and people just become exhausted. I had this conversation with a group of my wife's friends from high school in Minnesota. She was out visiting them, and they got on the phone and they said, "We want to have a little town hall with you, Jeff." And we discussed issue after issue. And then one of the women said, here's the problem. I have my life to live. I don't have a lot of time to check these things out. And I hear you making these arguments, and then I hear these other arguments coming across my cable station. And how is an ordinary person supposed to be able to sort this all out? And because we don't have the time and energy to sort out who's really telling the truth. And that is the really, really horrific impact of the flood the zone, lie all the time strategy. Is there's a new lie every day. So how do we take this on? Well, of course, we try to fact check. And having fact check organizations saying, we looked into it, this is not true, here's the real truth, that's helpful. And publicizing the results of that fact checking is helpful. But it's overwhelming when there's so many to the individual. So then we turn to some of the causes like social media that are an easy form to spread information and say, well, maybe they can play a role in alerting readers when there is something put up that is absolutely wrong. And so this is a struggle that Facebook and Twitter have been going through. Can they serve as fact police and alert people when there's information on Facebook or on Twitter that is simply wrong? And it's a hard thing to do because the millions and millions of posts that are done every day the hundreds of new issues that come up continuously, or new pieces of disinformation or ways of presenting it. There's another piece of this they've taken on, which is to try to detect the fake accounts and the information being spread by botnets. So if they see a ton of comments coming from on a particular issue that are very similar, they can say, oh, well, that's botnets generating thousands or millions of fake messages. Let's pull down those accounts. And so they're doing some of that, but that's very hard. So I'm glad they're making the effort, and I'm glad we're having the discussion. But the fact is, it is really difficult. There is no silver bullet here. There is no magic wand. So all of us have to try as individuals to help be part of that force. We can't just depend upon corrections in a newspaper or corrections by Facebook or Twitter or alerts. We have to see things and say to our peers and through our organizations, to our audiences, as you all are doing today, here is the truth. We have investigated it. Here is the fact. And if your friends promote one of these myths, let them know, yes, we know that was widely promoted, but it was fact-checked. It is wrong. We all have to become part of this effort to set the record straight. Even that it's just probably not enough, but it's the best we have. And if we don't engage in this manner, we will collapse in terms of the ability to have reasoned conversation about the issues we face and reasonable proposals to improve on where we are. And so it's essential we work this really hard. At the moment, in all these different fields of disinformation, and a ton of foreign policy disinformation, but the most important thing is this coming election. We are in an extraordinary moment of dark and dangerous governance by an authoritarian. That individual, Trump, is undermining the checks and balances. One major check in the Constitution, or balance, is that Congress can make sure the executive is following the law. That involves getting information and holding hearings and getting testimony. And the president has blocked the information and blocked the testimony. Another is the internal controls we've set up with whistleblower protection, and the president has attacked that. Another is IGs, inspector generals, and their role in organizations. And the president has attacked and fired the IGs that are doing things he doesn't like, two being fired from the State Department after an IG started investigating the Secretary of State for potential unethical and illegal behavior. So you have a president doing all that. This challenge is much bigger. And what we have to do is make sure we have a future administration that is committed to integrity with the public. And meanwhile, doing everything we can to attack the falsehoods in social media, in the news, cable news, etc. It feels overwhelming, like we're swimming in disinformation. And yet that's where we are. So this is why this is so important. That's why forums like what you're doing today are absolutely essential.
It's so important. And I think that is the perfect lead in to kind of where I wanted to land with this conversation with you. I know from what I've heard from our members and from the people I work with, our allies on this issue, there is so much hunger out there for solutions. And there are no great solutions, but we see this conversation as one of the first steps in getting people up to speed on the issue and understanding what we can do to start to chip away. And we're going to be having follow-up conversations as well to help make sure that people have the tools to identify problematic narratives and begin to push back. I know, particularly from my own research, that Republicans and the broader radical right have been aggressively working to lead the conversation on disinformation. And Senator, what you said about volume and amplification and the tactic of flooding the zone is so important there. There has been more and more evidence coming out lately that the Republicans' pressure campaigns against the tech platforms have actually been very successful in setting up some double standards in how certain tech platforms, particularly, enforce their own policies, resulting in preferential treatment for far-right activists like Lila Rose in that example I shared earlier. But Charlie Kirk, there was some important reporting this week on an example where his content was privileged and amplified. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on what we can do as NARAL members to push back there. How can we raise our voices in a helpful way? And what can we do to advance and amplify more productive conversations so that you and your colleagues aren't only hearing from one side of the issue?
Yes. So first, everyone needs to have trusted sources that they understand, have researched issues, and proceeded to try to give fair and honest evaluation. And NARAL is a trusted source on healthcare reproductive rights information. So we need to encourage people to turn to groups like NARAL and proceed to say, here is the claim that's being made. What is the real story? This is a strategy. It's kind of like a home base in a dangerous world. When I was growing up playing baseball, you can't be thrown out if your foot's on the base, right? You can't be misled if you're in touch with a trusted organization of high integrity that is identifying the myths that are coming out and providing the truth. And so thank you for playing that role in the reproductive space. And there's another saying that came up that was used a lot in many contexts, but I particularly remember it under McCain-Feingold. McCain-Feingold was an effort to limit the role of big campaign donations in our campaigns. And there were folks who said, no, we shouldn't limit individuals' ability to fund campaigns or to make donations, but we should just publicize it, that transparency is the best remedy. And the phrase was sunlight is the best disinfectant. So shining a light on the issue. So we all have to participate in shining a light. And since virtually everyone has social media accounts, they can use those social media accounts to say, by the way, friends, did you see that piece of disinformation? Here's the real story. And spread that story through our own individual networks. And that's helpful. We have to try to do the same thing that Senator Wyden and I do through our town halls. We hear people come in, they come up with some recent story that's been in the press or that mostly online, and we say, we'll get you we'll find out, we'll get the right answer, and we'll email it to everybody who is at this town hall, and so forth. And use whatever form of network we have to call out the lies, call out the disinformation, and set people straight. It doesn't mean conducting, a Twitter war all day long, but it does mean when you see something that you feel is harmful and wrong, get the right information from a trusted source and share it in your individual networks. Of course, weighing in with your members of Congress matters. And so make sure that they understand that you don't want them to be misled by the disinformation that's being put out in any particular field. So good facts, sharing them in whatever tools we possibly have, making sure it's part of a political conversation so those false facts don't influence your electeds, your state legislature, your city council, your county commission. These are the tools we can bring to bear, and it's so important for all of us to bring them to bear. If we don't, that disinformation from those who thrive on falsehoods to promote their particular item, their production of fossil fuels, or trying to stop reproductive rights in America, or so just hatred towards immigrants, we will lose so much that's valuable in the beauty of a democracy where the best arguments come forward and win. They can't come forward and win if we drown in falsehoods. So that's how we have to take it on. Trusted sources and reproducing the truth in every way we can.
That makes so much sense, Senator. And I think what you just said about how these bad actors thrive on falsehoods is so important for everyone on this in this conversation to remember. I mean, again, reproductive freedom is overwhelmingly the majority position in America. And we see this on so many other issues, from climate to Black Lives Matter to all of these things that progressives care about. And I think, I mean, this is one thing that Elise and I have been talking about more and more, and that we really touch on in the book and the podcast. Talking more about that and emphasizing that, you know, if we are able to have a legitimate conversation about this issue, if we are able to confront these issues head on, we win, is such an important thing to emphasize. So I really appreciate that.
You know, I wanted to mention the recent Supreme Court case because it isn't an example of how a false premise drove a law all the way to the Supreme Court. And the false premise was that abortions are so dangerous, an abortion clinic needs to have, or a doctor has to have, admitting privileges in a hospital. And therefore, the hospital, by not granting admitting privileges, could shut down the abortion opportunity for women. And that was a law that was enacted, and it was challenged and challenged and challenged. And finally, it got to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court narrowly said, no, this is not legitimate, that this is founded on a falsehood. This is founded on disinformation. And it is clearly an effort to restrict a constitutional right. But that was a close call. And there's going to be more and more and more of these cases with a whole range of tactics, many of them growing out of a disinformation campaign. And we are in very precarious ground with a court that's very ideologically shifted to the right. So it's really, I mean, you think about, why did the Republicans put so much effort into stealing a Supreme Court seat from Barack Obama? Mm-hmm. The Supreme Court is kind of the most powerful legislative body in America. The way it decides these issues is just sets more law than the laws that are being passed by Congress. So I just wanted to throw in, we need to be very aware of the role of the courts and the impact of court packing going on right now, because that was a narrow escape from a very effective disinformation campaign tied to a state law. So just toss that in as kind of another piece of this puzzle.
That is such an important point and a really good one to end on. I think more than anything else, that the Supreme Court highlights any conversation about the Supreme Court and what we've been seeing this year, and how likely it is to get worse next year if we don't win in 2020, is just, it's critical for us all to absorb and remember. We at NARAL, of course, talk a ton about the courts, and we were super engaged in conversations around the past two nominees. But yeah, I mean, disinformation has shown up in many recent court decisions on and oral arguments on reproductive health care in particular. And it continues to drive so many of these conversations. Well, Senator, I know that we are at the end of our time with you. I so much appreciate you coming on and sharing your perspective. I feel like I learned a ton about how you're thinking about it, how we can all raise our voices, and I'm sure our members did as well. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thank you for the really important work that all of you are doing. I don't think a few decades ago we would have envisioned that we would be at this point come that futuristic year, 2020. But here we are. So we have to be on the battlefield. We have to be in the fight. And thank you so much for being there.
Thank you, Senator. And I know the good news is when they push disinformation, it means that they don't have confidence they can win. So that's one hopeful thing to hang on to.
There we go.
All right. Have a good one. And thank you again. Take care. All right, everyone. Thank you so much. That was such a helpful conversation for me, and I hope that you all got as much out of it as I did. I want to flag that we have been sending a couple of questions through the polls, and I would really appreciate if you all would be able to respond and let us know what types of anti-democratic disinformation and misinformation you've been seeing in your own life. And I'd love to see a little bit of discussion about how you're thinking about and dealing with this problem, because it's so important. I'm going to pivot now because, this is a gigantic topic and we have limited time today, but we're going to talk in a little bit more detail now about the problem of disinformation from the tech side of things and what specifically we all can do to fight back. So I want to introduce my next guest, Ifeoma Ozema. Ifeoma is a tech policy expert with experience leading global public policy partnerships, public policy related content safety development, and US federal, state, and international policymaker engagement at Pinterest, Facebook, and at Google. Her health misinformation initiatives have been lauded by the World Health Organization, the Washington Post editorial board, and the New York Times. And Ifeoma is also the founder and principal of Earthseed, a consulting firm supporting individuals, organizations, and companies on issues relating to public policy, health disinformation, and other related communications. So Ifeoma, thank you so much for joining this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so excited to talk with you. And I feel like every time we chat, I learn so much about your perspective, and we just have such deep conversations about the issue. So I'm really excited to, hear your perspective on these different things, and also have our members get a little bit more information about kind of how this works in a more tactical sense. I will remind members that we'll have time for questions at the end of this conversation. So Ifeoma and I are going to try and speed through some kind of high-level discussion about tech, and then we will make sure to save some time. So just if you have any questions, I know a couple are starting to bubble up in the chat. We are saving those, and we will definitely get to them. But Ifeoma, before we really dive in, I'd love to hear your thoughts on Senator Merkley's conversation and what he was talking about.
The senator was exactly right about the way that disinformation moves across topics, but the way particularly that platforms have been influential in expanding the reach of disinformation actors. One of the things that I saw working at Facebook, Google, and then at Pinterest, in addition to the massive reach of disinformation, was just how effective the purveyors of disinformation are at influencing both platforms and then policymakers, which ended up all over Breitbart, Gateway Pundit, 4chan, 8chan, you name the platform. And so I was personally put at risk, and my family was as well, because of the work that I was doing. The folks like Lila Rose and Live Action and many thousands other disinformation actors know that they can intimidate people, both individuals and organizations, in order to not enforce policies against them. And they've done that for years.
It's so horrible to hear that happened to you. And I remember you being such a great advocate for repro freedom while you were at Pinterest, and in the other work that you've done. And it's so frustrating and so horrible that these things are allowed to continue. It bears repeating. You and I, we're all in good company. Again, 77% of Americans believe that abortion should be legal in the US. And we've had strong majorities say that for such a long time, for decades now. And I think people are sometimes confused about how we can have such a winning issue that's still painted as polarized or controversial, including by the platforms. But at least for me, and based on the research that I and my team do, it really is clear that disinformation is the reason. Health disinformation was a gigantic problem on issues of reproductive freedom for decades before social media existed. This intimidation, these kind of flooding the zone tactics and intimidating people who speak up on the issue has always been a part of this conversation and our fight for reproductive freedom. But that problem really has grown dramatically in the past couple of years. How have you seen that manifest in your work? And especially, how have you seen disinformation be targeted? Which groups are they really looking to push information at?
So one of the things that I did while I was at Pinterest, as we were working on misinformation policies, so Pinterest was one of the first platforms, social platforms at least, to establish a misinformation policy. So what is it that the platform defined as mis and disinformation, and then how would it address it? as part of that work, I commissioned an internal study that we did working with an outside group to actually take a look at the types of health disinformation that we were seeing on the platform. At most people who use Pinterest or know of Pinterest would not think of it as the kind of platform where people would go to target others with disinformation. And yet it's a particularly valuable space for the purveyors of disinformation because many of them are targeting women. Most of Pinterest users across the United States and across the world are women. 8 in 10 moms in the US are on Pinterest. And so what we found was not out of line with the demographics of the users on the platform. The top 2 areas of disinformation on the platform regarding health that we saw were HPV and breast cancer related. So areas that target women specifically, and then outside of that, vaccines, of course. So anything that targeted children's vaccines, and moms are the ones who are making those decisions for the most part for their families and for their children's health. So what we saw was a very concerted effort from folks like RFK Jr. and Dr. Mercola and many other folks, including Live Action, who were trying to target women on the platform because they knew that women were on the platform for many other reasons, for health and wellness and for party planning and for teaching and many other things that had nothing to do with disinformation, but were a captive audience, and therefore they could target them using the platform. And in a way, one of the things that I think is most fascinating, and many people who don't study this don't understand, even though they're visited with these messages all the time, is the disinformation actors are very good at using narratives. So instead of like a CBC page that has the top 10 facts about DTaP, or the top 10 facts about the HPV vaccine, what they'll present you with is a photo of a crying baby or a photo of a woman who is crying, saying that her life has been impacted negatively by vaccines in this way. It's the sort of thing that pulls you in, tears at your heartstrings, but is full of lies. But you don't even get to the point where you're questioning the lies because you're empathizing with this story.
That is such an important conversation. And I think that in the research that I do on how the radical right operates, we really have seen how they are so successful and so strategic about weaponizing storytelling in particular and imagery in particular, which is something that we at NARAL have been trying to address and trying to get smarter about. I mean, it's one of the reasons that we put out this big book and podcast. And I think for NARAL members who were on yesterday, we had a really great in-depth conversation about how to hold more courageous conversations and some of the tools that we can use to bring more empathy into the conversation, bring storytelling into the conversation, and make sure that people are able to empathize with the people who are actually affected by, the anti-choice abortion bans that have been moving through the states or any of these other issues that disinformation really affects. So I think that is just such an important point. I want to talk to you, Ifeoma, about electoral disinformation as well, but I want to follow up just real quick on the health disinformation, because we at NARAL have been talking so much about health disinformation in particular, and I consistently recommend that NARAL members just use that term and talk about it more often, because from what I've heard, it seems like tech, to the extent that they're able and willing to react to some of these things, are slightly more interested in organizing a response around issues that physically impact people and their lives and safety. So can you talk a little bit about how the platforms at least are thinking about that and what we can do to elevate and shine a light on this issue?
Yeah, one thing I think if you haven't worked in a platform, and most people haven't, they're on the platforms, they're black boxes. How do platforms make decisions? Who are the people making these decisions? And one thing that I think is really important to remember is that it's groups of individuals at these platforms who are making decisions about what millions and billions of people see and experience while they're on the platforms. The reason why, in my mind at least, health misinformation and disinformation have not been addressed as seriously until now, and even now, I would give the platforms a collective D- on their response to health disinformation, is because there hasn't been the pressure to address it. Platforms address things that they're forced to address. Platforms often, and Facebook is really good at this, and I used to work there, so it's no animus towards the platform specifically, but one of the phrases that Mark Zuckerberg has used often is that he doesn't want to be the arbiter of truth, or Facebook shouldn't be the arbiter of truth. On science issues, Facebook doesn't have to be the arbiter of truth. Facebook can decide to side with science and to decide to side with scientists on topics like vaccinations and reproductive health, but has not chosen to because it hasn't had to. There hasn't been the same kind of pressure from pro-science camps and from pro-science policymakers and individuals, those of us who use the platforms, who are consumers of the platforms, as there has been from live action and those who want to push the platforms into keeping content that is full of lies on those spaces. And so one of the things that I think is important when thinking about what Twitter and Facebook and Google and Reddit and whichever platform, you name it, is doing is that we have some control there and we need to exercise it as consumers. That can come in many forms. It can come in petitions that are sent to the platforms. It can come in the form of reaching out to the platforms directly, and then through organizations like NARAL and working with organizations that care to make clear that consumers are not okay with the platforms continuing the same old narrative that they've had, that they can't control what is on their own platform. The First Amendment argument is thrown out often in a bad faith way, in my opinion, because the First Amendment applies to the government. It's a protection from the government. Platforms have the right and ability and exercise it every day in the spaces they care about to remove content. There's a reason why pornography is not proliferating all over Facebook in most spaces, and that's because advertisers don't want to see it next to their content. That doesn't have to do with health or safety or the First Amendment. You don't see the platforms using that argument for why they're keeping pornography and spam off of their platforms. So then why wouldn't that be the same case for health and health disinformation? We know that there's imminent harm to us as individuals and to certain groups when disinformation proliferates. And so we need to hold platforms accountable and not just wait for policymakers to do it or wait for the platforms to decide to care.
I think that is so important and something I really want to emphasize. And I think it also ties in with some of the things that Senator Merkley was saying earlier in this conversation. I mean, we have a couple of gatekeepers who so far have not been willing to make hard and fast decisions on how to deal with this issue, which is why this issue is still proliferating. But I think a lot of the solution goes back to a lot of the solution with both the tech platforms and with getting Congress to think and talk more about this and start to really dig into some potential solutions is really in our hands and is really about raising our voices. Because again, we see so often how aggressively the radical right and Republicans do this. The Lila Rose example is another really good one, but there are so many others of, a anti-choice movie Twitter account getting briefly suspended around some questionable QAnon content, and then raising hell and going all the way up to Senate hearings about that automatic action on Twitter. So, I mean, we just have endless examples of the platforms implementing a double standard and really bowing to pressure. And we frankly haven't seen the same amount of pressure on our side as we have from the right. I know you know, and everybody on this conversation knows that NARAL is a political organization, and ultimately our members work to make change by electing pro-choice champions and raising our voices in this conversation. And of course, disinformation is a huge barrier in our ability to pass good pro-choice legislation to protect reproductive freedom, but also for our electoral work. I mean, if we have, again, more than 3/4 of Americans on our side, why are we still facing attacks on reproductive freedom? The radical right is just so brilliant at coming up with ways to muddy the waters on our issue, to muddy the waters on the issue of disinformation and how it exists in the world and how it's handled, and to really mislead people about what their proposals would actually do. and who they would hurt specifically. And again, even to block voters from getting fair representation at the ballot box. So before we start to pivot to some kind of tactical things that NARAL members can do to really get involved in this issue, I want to make sure that you have a chance to talk a little bit about how disinformation affects not just reproductive freedom and other health-related issues, but our democracy in general and what we should be thinking about there.
In the same ways that those who are spreading health disinformation target certain groups, moms, the Black community, the Latinx community, you name it, they're doing the same regarding democratic information. Some of the same content that we saw, and from some of the same groups even, which is odd, was around, just like the senator said, voting information and polling stations. And there's been a huge drive of disinformation around the census. That sort of content is not seen, unfortunately, by many platforms as causing imminent harm. But as we know about something like the census and the count every 10 years, that is directly tied to representation. That's directly tied to the amount of funding in certain communities. And so not taking it seriously causes harm to all of us. And one of the things that I would urge NARAL members to do, and I do this myself and ask my friends to do it, is when you see disinformation, even if it's presented in a joke form, especially if it has to do with the election or the census or any other democratic function of our society, is to call it out and to ask people, if it's someone you know who's sharing it, ask them why they're sharing it. And ask them where it came from and what's the motivation of those who have shared it. Because I think it catches people off guard when they're asked questions and not just attacked for sharing nonsense. And so I've had that urge many times, especially with family members who share this stuff. Like, come on, you have to understand how harmful this is. And yet you're sharing it either because you think it's funny or because you don't think that it's a lie. And so one of the things that I've been urging folks to do is to really interrogate what the reasons why people share the content, and then to urge folks to think more critically about where it's coming from. Because some of it, and I've seen this on TikTok, on Instagram, especially if it's in a video or photo form or meme form, pretends like it's poking fun at the topic, but is really just another way of spreading disinformation.
I think that's so important. And I have seen a ton of research. I mean, academics have been looking more and more into this problem lately. And I have just seen a ton of research about the importance of inoculation on this issue, by which they mean preparing your friends, your family, to see disinformation. If they know to expect it, it is much less likely to stick, and people are much more likely to have questions or be a little bit skeptical, or even do a little bit of their own research and ask some of those questions that you're mentioning, Ifoma. And I think that just talking about the issue more with your family, even if you're not quite ready to directly debunk a particular claim or things like that, being able to tell people that disinformation is out there, it is a major problem across these different issues for our election, for our health, especially in this time of pandemic, is a gigantic thing that you can do just right off the bat. I mean, the more we hear this term, the more we talk about this term, the more likely people are to be able to start to do that thinking and ask some of those questions. Okay, I want to pivot to talk specifically about what NARAL members can do to fight back. And we've kind of started on that. So I think that we're ready for that conversation. And I should be clear, this is going to take a ton of time and energy for people really to kind of get up to speed and start debunking this issue in a way that at the scale that we need this to happen. Because what we're talking about is both inoculating our friends and family against the worst impacts of all of these different types of disinformation in the short term, while also building a stronger national conversation on the issue, one that isn't totally dominated by radical right-wing voices. All of our members here today should know that we're just scratching the surface in this conversation. I want to be really clear about that. We're sharing some resources over chat that should be helpful for folks who want to dig deeper on this issue. Again, NARAL's new book and podcast go much deeper. But this also won't be the only time we have member events and trainings on this topic. So I encourage people to be on the lookout for that. But Ifeoma, I want to dig in here, and I'm going to start by sharing one really simple slide about raising the volume and how anti-choice voices dominate social media. We've really seen that anti-choice voices drown out pro-choice voices on the issue of reproductive freedom. And this is looking at Twitter specifically, although it's true across platforms. They talk about pro-life ideology, anti-choice ideology constantly, while we progressives talk about a whole range of issues and with a lot less frequency and regularity. The easiest things that we can do is really just get comfortable talking more about reproductive freedom and abortion and elevating good information with our own audiences. And of course, it's important not to repeat the problematic frames, but really to focus on spreading helpful and positive information. And what we see on the slide right here is just a quick graphic that highlights the difference in the volume of conversation on reproductive freedom around a couple of different issues. You can see how the anti-choice activists and the radical right on the right side of the screen are really aggressive about elevating a couple of key flashpoints, whereas the pro-choice conversation hums along at a kind of steady pace, but is much lower compared to the aggressive anti-choice conversation. So I think that that's just one thing that we can start with, really raising the volume and shifting the balance in this conversation as priority one. But I'd love to hear your take, Ifeoma.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I guess we've all seen is that those on the radical right and those who are anti-choice are disciplined in their messaging. They stay on message like it's their job. And that needs to be our mantle that we're taking up as well. We often, and you see the same thing in vaccine and anti-vaccine conversations, anti-vaxxers are very good at continuing to talk about the same things and to use the same talking points, the same stories that have already been debunked, because they know they can reach more people each time they talk about these things. We need to have the same view that the more we talk about pro-science messaging, the more that we talk about reproductive health rights, the more that we talk about how the far right and those who aren't even far right, but those who are using that same messaging to try to chip away at reproductive rights are harming all of us and harming our society, the better. People need to hear this regularly and just as regularly as they're hearing the anti-choice messaging. But I think it's easy to become complacent because we know that our position is right and it's backed up by science and it's good for society. And so there isn't as much of a push to talk about it all of the time, but we have to.
Yeah, I think that's just so important. And it is the kind of thing, we really do have a very large gap to close, but it's the kind of thing that we can start doing now and that we can really use to lay the groundwork for some bigger, longer term change. I've mentioned this a couple of times and I'm going to keep hammering this home. The tech platforms and also Congress just don't hear from us as much as they hear from our opponents. And it is having long-term impacts on the conversations that we're able to have and how people are able to hear us. And it's starting to rig the game in the anti-choice movement's favor. It is time that we really dig in here.
Yeah.
All right. I want to show. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Ifeoma.
Yeah, really quickly to that point about members of Congress not hearing from us. I think, and I completely understand that it can be intimidating to reach out to a member, especially if you're not doing it as part of an organization. But all you have to do is send a quick email. Members of Congress have to read and have to respond to constituent messages. So if it's once a week that you make a habit of it, sending a note out, and it can be the same note to all of your representatives, why not? Send them examples of what you're saying on the platforms, because they regularly, I was on the public policy teams at Facebook, Google, and Pinterest. At Facebook and Google, at least, there are hundreds of people globally who work specifically on engaging with policymakers and on lobbying policymakers on certain issues. If they're lobbying policymakers on issues, the people should be as well, because those policymakers are there as representatives of us and not as representatives of the tech companies.
That's so important. I know we're getting low on time and we want to save some time for questions. So I'm going to go through these last two slides really quickly. But I just want to show one more slide that really emphasizes what you can do right now to help inoculate your friends and family. Research really shows that when people know to expect disinformation, again, it's less likely to stick. So it's critically important that we get people familiar with the idea that they're likely to see this false information. And again, particularly on issues of health and on the elections. Use the term health disinformation in your personal conversations and tweet, and really encourage your friends and family to think through the type of information that they're seeing online. We're highlighting a couple of key questions that you should consider when confronting content online, and something, again, that can be really emphasized and pushed with your friends and allies. Ifeoma, I'd love your take on this because this is something you talk about so often.
Yeah, a lot of this is very helpful for disinformation specifically, but they're basic media literacy things that we should be thinking about all of the time. If you think about disinformation and health disinformation specifically, like you think about spam or fraud messaging, then it's a really good way to just be on guard and to make sure that people in your circle are also on guard for the type of targeting that exists everywhere, specifically on reproductive issues, but also on issues having to do with our democracy.
Yeah, that's so important. Okay, last slide here before we pivot to some questions. I get a ton of questions from people, from friends and family, about how they can engage with the people in their own networks who believe health disinformation and begin to walk those people back from the truth. I am seeing one question in our own chat right now about someone flagging that they have avoided tweeting or talking about health freedom, repro freedom, and health disinformation out of a concern for offending family members or talking about conversations that people that their followers might not want to discuss. And I think one of the really important things that I want to emphasize is that NARAL is investing heavily in figuring out what tools we can give people to make these conversations easier and more comfortable. If you all were here with us yesterday for the plenary at 1 p.m., we focused on courageous conversations, and we were rolling out a whole bunch of new messaging research about tools and tactics that we can really use with some of the family members who aren't entirely comfortable talking about abortion in particular or reproductive freedom more broadly. So if you missed that session or are looking for more detailed information on having those conversations in a disinformation context, I just really want to take this time to plug that NARAL has a ton of great content there, and we'll be continuing to roll out more trainings and resources on that topic over the next several months. Ifeoma, I know that you've been thinking a ton about how to kind of target those people who you know and have a real connection with, and who you might actually have a hope of kind of pulling back from the brink on disinformation. I've been doing a ton of message research there as well about the effective frames. And I was really interested to hear you mention questions earlier, because that actually, from our research, is turning out to be one of the most effective ways that people can start to deconstruct those conversations. I think what we know from cognitive science and the research about how people retain and process information is that when you confront people directly and that you really challenge their viewpoints and disagree with them in what comes across or reads to them as an aggressive way, people tend to feel like their identity is at stake, and they really tend to dig in their heels and double down on the information. And when you attack them like that directly, or again, if they feel like they're attacked, which is a very easy thing for people to slip into, you can actually have the reverse effect of what you're looking for, and making them more stubborn about the information and making them really solidifying it in their brains. One of the things that you can do to start to avoid that is asking questions and raising the gaps that they haven't really thought about, and the stories and the empathy that isn't really going into these conversations, so that they can start to do the thinking and really build those pathways for themselves, which is the way that we make sure it sticks. I think we emphasized earlier and talked a little bit about how important storytelling is in this conversation. And one thing I consistently recommend is making sure that people are able to empathize with the pregnant people or people who need reproductive freedom, because that is just such a big missing piece in this conversation. So we recommend asking questions about the effect and the impact of these types of laws, and what we think those people should be able to access, or how we should be able to deal with overreaching restrictions, how those restrictions would be implemented or enforced. Ifoma, I know you've done a ton of thinking about this as well. I do want to save the last couple of minutes for some questions, but I'd love to hear your take on that as well.
Let me just say one thing really quickly, and so that we can jump into the questions. Broadening the conversation is helpful. So if someone is sharing health disinformation, especially as it regards to reproductive health and rights, a good question that I like to ask is, what does the restriction on reproductive rights and access mean for your health access? What would it mean to restrict access to health for you? And getting people to think about how whatever they're sharing not just affects the other or this other group of people who they don't have empathy for, but how it could affect them too, I've found personally to be effective.
That's such great advice and so important. Again, this is a conversation that we could spend probably 5 hours digging into about how to have those courageous conversations. And we did do a little bit of that yesterday. But I want to emphasize for folks, we'll be continuing to have this conversation through the fall, and we will be rolling out more and more resources and trainings on this topic specifically over the next couple of months. So I do want to make sure that we have time to pivot to just a couple of questions at the end here. And I would love to give an open call for folks to enter some questions in the chat, and then I'll read them out and we will both try to respond. And while people are thinking and typing, Ifoma, I'd love to hear what kind of questions are really common and what you hear from people asking about this issue.
From the platform perspective specifically, most people don't even understand that platforms have public policy teams and have people whose roles it is specifically to lobby members of Congress and at the state level, state policymakers and governors and whoever. And that lack of understanding is really a miss and detrimental to the general public, because then they don't understand why certain things aren't being done by policymakers to rein in the platforms. And they don't understand why certain topics aren't being brought up by policymakers. So understanding that, then I would hope that consumers and the general public would then take up lobbying for themselves and on their behalves, because they're the ones who are making money for the platforms and who are making it possible for the platforms to hire people to then go and lobby Congress.
That makes a ton of sense. So while I'm waiting for some questions to be flagged for us in the chat that we have, there were some earlier ones in the conversation that I thought were really interesting and really helpful. One person asked and flagged that pro-Trumpers often come back to them and say he gives them hope when confronted with facts as a dodge from really engaging in this issue or being able to talk through the disinformation or, have those kind of critical conversations. So the question here was how to counteract this and how you deal with people who just don't want to have those conversations in the first place. And I know, Ifoma, you and I have talked a bit about knowing where your audience is and where you want to direct the information that you do have to share and that can start to push back on this. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that.
So this is a two-parter. The reason why disinformation actors use narratives is to get that exact response. That, oh, I believe, or, oh, I just like the way this makes me feel. That is not a conversation based in fact. And so if it's someone, and so here's the second part, not everyone is worth having a conversation with. I'm not going to have, there's no world in which I could have a conversation with Lila Rose and explain to her why reproductive access and reproductive rights are important. And so she's not someone or the kind of person who I'm going to dedicate time to. If I got that sort of response from a cousin or from my sister, who thankfully I would not get that from because she believes in science, but if I did, I would then want to have a conversation about why. why do you feel that way? Why do you have hope in this? What are the things that are not giving you hope? So that then we can talk about that and have a conversation about why the people who are sharing this content know you feel this way and are doing it to target you and manipulate you.
That makes so much sense. And I think it really fits with the next question that's been flagged from the chat. One of the members writes, any ideas or help or direct reference for voters who just scream baby killer or other problematic language like that, which is truly the words that they use, really aggressive conversations, when you try to bring up supporting a moderate candidate who is either pro-reproductive freedom or otherwise progressive. This person flags that they can't find anything on that narrative specifically and how to push back on that. And I think that that makes sense. I mean, we generally don't recommend responding directly to those types of really abusive, really problematic attacks online. But I think one of the things that we do recommend is thinking about who you can legitimately move. And sometimes you can use other people's comments or other things like that as a platform to push helpful information and to push back on the problematic information to their followers or to your followers. You don't always have to directly engage in the conversation with these bad actors, especially when it's clear that they're operating in bad faith, but you can have a conversation with the people who matter and the people who you can authentically influence on social media, and use any of those kind of opportunities or any of those kind of attacks as a chance to really elevate critical stories and really elevate the values and why we care about this issue. Any thoughts on that, Ifoma?
I'd also add that the 77% figure that you shared earlier in the conversation with Senator Merkley is something that many people probably don't know. They probably have a sense that most people agree that reproductive access or access to reproductive healthcare is important. But even sharing that figure, I think, can be important and can be helpful and can help people to understand that views like X person is a baby killer are fringe. They really are not mainstream. And what the far right and those who are anti-choice are trying to do is make it seem like those views are mainstream.
Yeah, that's so important. And I think that it is, I mean, of course, it's often difficult to have these conversations with people who are definitely not operating in bad faith. But the good news is that we don't have to. I have found in many of the focus groups that I've sat in on and listened to that the majority of people who we end up talking to about these issues assume their neighbors are anti-choice. And everyone who comes into a focus group tends to think that the people around them are more anti-choice than they are, which we just know from tons of research on that topic and also just the polling that that's not possible, that the people who are in those conversations, in the focus groups, in their neighborhoods, are way more pro-choice than people tend to assume or tend to think. So I think our people tend to join these conversations from a defensive posture with the assumption that everybody's against them or that nobody will recognize their beliefs, when in fact we see across the board so often that the opposite is true. That when people start talking about these issues, they suddenly start to feel validated, that their opinions matter, that they can be comfortable and confident sharing their opinions, and that the people in their networks, their friends, their family, their followers, will agree and really validate that. I know we're low on time. We've got 1 minute before we have to close, but I want to just flag one last question from the chat. This person noted that in the interest of focusing on empathy and recognizing the power of narrative, how helpful is it to combat disinformation by sharing one's own abortion experiences? I think that this is a critical question. And Ifoma, I want to give you a couple of seconds to react, although we're low on time here.
So important to the extent that people are comfortable sharing their own stories. As I mentioned, I was doxxed. It's not fun, and it is really scary. And so I wouldn't push people to share things they're not comfortable with sharing, but it is so important to others and many folks who won't say anything, but are watching and listening to see folks share their own stories. And they don't even just have to be abortion stories, just sharing stories about access and what it means to have access and reliable access to healthcare are important.
I think that's so important. And I think this is the perfect place to land. Yes, it is incredibly valuable to share your abortion story if you have one. Storytelling in general in all of these conversations is critical to getting people to understand the stakes of this issue and getting us to move the needle. I also want to emphasize right before we close that just because you or a friend doesn't have an abortion story doesn't mean that you can't share stories. Sharing stories about how you got to where you are on this issue, a story that your friend told you, or an article that you read that really affected you, any of those stories that kind of highlight your personal journey can be super effective in leading people towards where they need to be on this issue. Okay, we are at time. So Ifeoma, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Every time we talk, I feel like I learn so much. I want to give a couple of announcements before we move to the next round of sessions. So everyone, please make sure to visit the Expo booth area to learn more about anti-choice disinformation. And specifically, subscribe to NARAL's new podcast. In 15 minutes, we're going to start our next summit programming in the sessions part of the conference. We invite you to join either the 50-state Fight for Reproductive Freedom, which is your chance to hear NARAL state affiliate and executive directors talk about the challenges and strategies for advocacy and electoral work across the political spectrum, or relational organizing, using the power of community to win elections. NARAL really wants to help you reach out to your friends and family and share more with them about why you need them to join you in committing to vote this fall. So you can join that session to learn how. All right, everyone, thank you so much for joining. Ifeoma, I know that you're on the line, even though you're not visible in the chat anymore. But again, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to chat and to thank Senator Merkley as well. Ifeoma, if you want to say a couple of last words and a goodbye.
I just say thank you so much, not only for inviting me, but for the work you're doing. It is so important. There are millions of people who aren't NARAL members who are impacted positively by the work you're doing, and it's so appreciated.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for sharing with us. I really think that as we start to raise our voices, you're right, we can impact many more people through our networks. Okay, thank you, everyone. We're going to sign off now. But again, I hope you join one of our later sessions. There's going to be a ton of great content. And yeah, we really appreciate you taking the time to talk about disinformation with us today.